If I sign this, my family lives. That was the only thought I allowed myself to have as the royal seal burned red against the center of our kitchen table. Not literally, of course. Wax did not burn once it cooled. But that mark, the black crown pressed into crimson wax, felt hotter than any flame. It sat between the chipped sugar bowl, my father's medicine bottles, and the stack of bills I had been pretending not to count for 3 weeks. Outside, late winter rain tapped against the window above the sink, soft and patient, as if even the weather knew it was rude to interrupt a family falling apart. My father slept in the next room, his breathing thin and uneven beneath the old quilt my mother had sewn before she died. My little brother, Noah, had left his muddy sneakers by the door again, one lace snapped, the soles almost worn through. He was 13 and still tried to act like he was not hungry when there was only enough soup for 2 bowls. I was 21, old enough to know pride did not keep a roof over anyone's head, and young enough to still wish it could. The letter had arrived at sunset, carried by a royal courier in a black coat who never stepped fully inside. He looked at our peeling walls, our cracked floor tiles, the cheap tea cooling in my cup, and then at me. Not with pity. With recognition. As if he had delivered this kind of mercy before and knew exactly what it cost. House Whitmore owed the crown for unpaid wartime taxes, medical levies, and penalties I did not understand, all written in elegant ink as if beautiful handwriting could make cruelty polite. If the debt was not settled within 7 days, our land would be seized. My father would lose his care. Noah would be taken into royal service until the debt was paid. That sentence made my hands go cold. Noah, who still hummed when he tied his scarf. Noah, who saved the burnt edges of toast because he said they tasted like campfires. Noah, who had already lost a mother and half a childhood. Then there was the second page. A proposal. No, not a proposal. A purchase dressed in velvet language. If Ethan Whitmore, registered Omega of noble bloodline, agreed to enter marriage with His Majesty Alpha King Alexander Vale, all debts of House Whitmore would be forgiven. Full protection would be granted. Medical support would be restored. The family home would remain under Whitmore name. I read it once. Twice. By the 3rd time, the words blurred. Everyone in Valeheart knew the king's name. Alexander Vale, the Ice Crown. The war hero. The Alpha who never smiled in portraits. The man nobles praised in public and feared in whispers. They said his palace was colder than the mountains, that he trusted no one, that every Omega presented to him had been sent away before spring. I should have been terrified. I was. But terror was a luxury for people with choices. I looked toward my father's room and listened to that fragile breath. I looked at Noah's shoes by the door. Then I picked up the pen. My fingers trembled so badly the first stroke of my name came out crooked. Ethan Whitmore. A name that had once belonged to me. When the ink dried, it felt like I had left a version of myself on that paper, small and helpless and still hoping someone would stop me. No one did. The courier folded the contract with careful hands and slipped it into a leather case. Before he left, a loose corner of the final page lifted in the draft from the open door. I saw one line near the bottom, half covered by a strip of black ink, crossed out so heavily it was almost hidden. Almost. Candidate must possess scent compatibility with His Majesty. The courier noticed my eyes on it. For the first time, his perfect expression cracked. Only for a second. Then he shut the case, bowed, and said, "The carriage will arrive at dawn, Lord Whitmore." After he left, the house became painfully quiet. I washed my father's teacup. I folded Noah's scarf. I packed one small bag with 2 shirts, my mother's silver thimble, and the rosemary soap I made last summer because it reminded me of better days. I did not cry until I found Noah's spelling homework on the table, a messy page where he had written the word family 10 times, each one a little crooked, each one trying its best to stay in line. The carriage arrived before the sun had fully climbed over the hills, black as a sealed envelope and twice as silent. I stood on the porch with my small bag in both hands, wearing my best white coat, the one with the repaired cuff I hoped no one would notice. Noah was still asleep because I had slipped a drop of lavender syrup into his tea the night before, enough to keep him resting, not enough to harm him. I told myself that was mercy. If he had watched me leave, I might not have been strong enough to go. My father woke just as the driver opened the carriage door. He called my name from the bedroom, weak and confused, and the sound nearly split me in half. I did not go back. I pressed my fingers to my mouth, touched them to the doorframe, and stepped into the cold. The royal palace stood 5 hours away, beyond the capital, where the roads widened and the houses grew taller, cleaner, farther apart. I had seen paintings of it in schoolbooks, but paintings could not capture how lonely it looked in real life. It rose from the cliffs like something carved out of winter, all pale stone, black iron gates, and windows that reflected the gray sky without letting any warmth in. By the time I arrived, my hands were numb inside my gloves. A line of servants waited on the front steps, dressed in silver and navy, their faces calm in the practiced way of people trained never to react. No one welcomed me as a bride. They welcomed me as an appointment. I was bathed, dressed, measured, powdered, and pinned into ceremonial white so heavy it felt like wearing snow. The collar sat high against my throat. The sleeves swallowed my wrists. When one maid tugged the fabric tighter around my waist, I flinched, embarrassed by how quickly my body betrayed me. She paused, then looked away as if kindness was forbidden here. "His Majesty dislikes delays," she murmured. That was all. The wedding took place in the throne chapel, under a ceiling painted with old kings and golden wolves. Every noble eye turned when I entered. I felt their judgment before I saw their faces. Too pale. Too young. Too poor. Bought, not chosen. And at the end of the aisle stood Alexander Vale. He was taller than I expected, dressed in black formal wear with a crown of dark silver resting in his white blonde hair. His skin was fair, his expression unreadable, and his eyes were a cold, clear blue that made me forget the next breath for one quiet second. Not because he was beautiful, though he was. Because he looked like a man who had already buried every soft thing inside himself. He did not smile when I reached him. He did not lean close. When the priest asked for his vow, Alexander answered in a voice so steady it seemed to belong to the stone walls. I tried to match him, but my own words came out thinner. The ring he placed on my finger was heavy and cold, sliding over my knuckle like a lock finding its place. There was no kiss. No bond. No whispered promise meant only for me. Just applause from people who sounded relieved that the transaction had gone smoothly. That night, I was taken to the royal suite, a room larger than my entire childhood home, with a fireplace tall enough to stand in and a bed I was too afraid to touch. Alexander entered minutes later, removed his gloves, and set them neatly on the table. I could not look at him for long, so I focused on the rug beneath my feet, deep blue with silver thread. "Lord Whitmore," he said. "Not Ethan. Never Ethan. Your family is safe. Their debts have been cleared. Your father's physician will arrive by morning." My throat tightened so suddenly I had to swallow twice before I could speak. "Thank you, Your Majesty." Something in his gaze shifted, but only barely. He walked to the writing desk, opened a drawer, and placed a small silver knife on the table between us. My stomach dropped. Then he stepped back. "The door is not locked," he said. "If I frighten you, take that and leave the room." I stared at him, certain I had misunderstood. He was the Alpha King. I was the Omega bride bought to solve his problem. Yet he had just handed me the only weapon in the room and moved away as if distance was the one kindness he knew how to offer. "Why?" I whispered. Alexander looked toward the fire, not at me. For a moment, the king in him vanished, and what remained was someone terribly tired. "Because no one should feel trapped on their wedding night." I had no answer. Shame warmed my face, sharp and confusing, because I had expected cruelty and found something worse, restraint I did not understand. Later, after he left me the bed and took the chair near the window, I pretended to sleep. But just before dawn, when the fire had burned low and the palace was silent, I felt the weight of a cloak settle gently over my shoulders. His scent lingered in the wool, clean cedar, cold air, and something painfully lonely. Then his voice, almost too quiet to hear, brushed the dark. "I am sorry I brought you into this." By morning, the whole palace knew the king had not touched his bride, and somehow that became my failure too. I learned it from the way the maids avoided my eyes while fastening my jacket, from the pause before they called me Your Grace, from the faint smile one footman tried to hide when I walked into breakfast alone. The royal dining room was longer than the road in front of my old house, with the table polished so brightly I could see my own nervous face in it. Alexander sat at the far end, already dressed for council in a black coat with silver buttons, reading a stack of papers as if our wedding night had been nothing more than bad weather. "Sit," he said without looking up. There were 20 chairs between us. I chose the one nearest the door. His eyes lifted for half a second, unreadable, then returned to the papers. A servant placed breakfast in front of me: poached eggs, toast cut into perfect triangles, berries arranged like jewels, and tea so pale it looked almost clear. It was beautiful. It was cold. I forced down 3 bites because every noble seated along the side tables was watching to see if the purchased Omega knew how to hold a fork. My sleeve slipped back when I reached for the cup, revealing the red mark where a pin had scraped my wrist during dressing. It was tiny, nothing worth mentioning, but Alexander's gaze caught it. I pulled my hand beneath the table. He said nothing. That silence hurt more than it should have. After breakfast, I was taken through a maze of corridors to begin royal instruction. How to stand beside the throne. How to lower my eyes without seeming weak. Which families hated which families but smiled anyway. I repeated names until they tangled in my head. By noon, my shoulders ached from holding the correct posture. By 3, my feet were sore from walking marble floors in stiff formal shoes. By 4, I had been corrected 11 times for saying thank you to servants. "A royal consort does not thank staff for basic duty," Lady Marin, my etiquette tutor, said, her mouth thin as a paper cut. "It makes people forget their place." I thought of Noah thanking the old neighbor who brought us apples every fall, even when half of them were bruised. "Maybe forgetting place is not always the worst thing," I said quietly. The room went still. Lady Marin stared at me like I had dropped a candle into dry grass. Before she could answer, the door opened. Alexander stood there, tall and composed, the hallway light catching in his pale hair. His presence changed the air immediately. Lady Marin bowed so quickly her necklace swung forward. "Your Majesty, the lesson is over," he said. "His Grace is tired." His Grace. Not Ethan. Still, the words landed like a hand placed between me and the room. Lady Marin's expression tightened. "Of course." I followed him into the corridor, walking half a step behind because no one had taught me what else to do. The passage narrowed near the east wing where old portraits crowded the walls, kings with stern eyes and queens with hands folded like secrets. Alexander stopped so suddenly I nearly walked into him. "You should not provoke Marin," he said. My face warmed. I was not trying to provoke her. Intent matters less here than consequence. "Then I will try to be silent next time." The words came out sharper than I meant. I regretted them instantly. Alexander turned. In the narrow corridor, he was too close enough that I noticed a small ink stain on his thumb, so ordinary it almost startled me. The Alpha King, feared by half the kingdom, had smudged ink on his hand like a tired clerk. His gaze dropped to my wrist. "Who scratched you?" I hid it behind my sleeve. "No one. It was an accident." "That was not my question." His voice remained calm, but something underneath it cooled the air. I should have been afraid. Instead, I felt exposed in a way I did not know how to name. "It does not matter." For a long moment, he simply looked at me. Then he reached into his coat pocket, took out a small tin of ointment, and set it on the window ledge beside us. He did not touch me. He did not ask permission in front of passing servants, or make a scene that would turn my embarrassment into gossip. He only said, "For the wrist. And your heels." I stared at the tin. How did you know about my heels? His expression closed, but not before I caught something almost guilty in his eyes. You left blood on the chapel steps. My breath caught. He had seen. Last night, during the vows, while everyone else watched the crown and the ring, he had noticed the places where the new shoes hurt me. Before I could answer, a group of nobles turned the corner. Alexander stepped back at once, his face returning to winter. Walk beside me, he ordered, louder now, cold enough for them to hear. The warmth of the moment vanished so quickly I wondered if I had imagined it. But when we passed the nobles, his body shifted slightly between me and their staring eyes, blocking me from them without ever looking down. That evening, when I returned to my room, the fireplace was lit, a tray of honey tea waited on the table, and every pair of formal shoes in my wardrobe had been replaced with softer ones. No note. No explanation. Only the little tin of ointment, moved from the window ledge to my bedside, as if the palace itself had learned where I hurt. For 3 days, I tried not to think about the shoes. That sounds ridiculous, I know. A person should be able to survive a kind gesture without turning it over in his mind like a secret note, but the palace had made me suspicious of anything soft. The new shoes fit perfectly. The tea arrived every evening with just enough honey. The fireplace was lit before I came back from lessons, never too hot, never too low. It was the sort of care that did not ask to be thanked, which somehow made it harder to ignore. Alexander never mentioned any of it. In public, he remained carved from winter. He corrected ministers with a glance, silenced arguments by lifting one hand, and spoke to me with the same formal distance he used for visiting diplomats. Lord Whitmore. Your Grace. Stand here. Walk there. Smile now. I told myself I preferred it that way. Distance was safer. Distance made the shape of this marriage easier to understand. Then, on the 4th afternoon, I ruined that careful lie by getting lost. The palace had too many corridors and not enough mercy. I had been sent from the music room to the East Library, which should have been simple, except every hallway looked like it had been designed by someone who hated visitors. After 15 minutes, I found myself in a narrow service passage behind the council wing, holding a folded schedule and feeling personally betrayed by architecture. That was when I heard Alexander's voice through a half-open door. The marriage was necessary, he said. My steps stopped. I knew I should leave. Eavesdropping was dangerous, and in a palace, information seemed to grow teeth. But then another voice answered, older and sharper. Lord Cresswell, one of the royal advisers. Necessary, yes. Sentimental, no. The boy is useful because his scent calms the instability. Nothing more. The word useful pressed into me like a thumb over a bruise. Alexander did not respond quickly enough. In that pause, every small kindness changed shape. The shoes. The tea. The cloak. The ointment. Not care, maybe? Maintenance. A responsible owner keeping a fragile thing from breaking before it had served its purpose. He is not to be discussed that way, Alexander said at last, low and cold. My chest tightened, but the damage had already been done. Lord Cresswell gave a dry little laugh. Your Majesty, forgive me, but affection would complicate a solution that is already delicate. You chose him because the reports were clear. Ethan Whitmore is compatible. My name in that room sounded like a diagnosis. I stepped back, but my shoulder brushed a small side table. A porcelain shepherdess wobbled, tipped, and landed in my hands by pure panic and luck. I stood there clutching a tiny smiling woman with a painted sheep, too horrified to breathe. Of all the ways to be discovered, being betrayed by decorative farm life felt especially unfair. The door opened. Alexander stood in front of me. His expression did not change, but his eyes moved from my face to the porcelain figure, then back again. Are you lost? He asked. There were 100 answers I could have given. Yes, in your palace. Yes, in this marriage. Yes, somewhere between fear and wanting to believe you were kind. Instead, I placed the shepherdess back on the table with the dignity of someone who had not nearly committed treason against home decor. I was looking for the library, Your Majesty. He looked at me for a moment too long. I saw it then, the tiny shift in his face when I used his title. Not anger. Not irritation. Something quieter. Hurt, maybe, though that made no sense. Ethan, he said. My name sounded different in his voice. Too careful. I hated that it still warmed something in me. Do not, I whispered before I could stop myself. Please do not say it like you mean it. His hand, half lifted, fell back to his side. Behind him, Lord Cresswell appeared in the doorway and looked at me as if I were a crack in the palace wall. Your Grace, he said smoothly, private council matters are not appropriate for delicate ears. Alexander turned his head. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Then speak with more respect in rooms that have doors. Lord Cresswell went pale and bowed. It was a small defense. Almost nothing. But it was public enough to be noticed and private enough to be denied. That only made it worse. I wanted to be grateful. I wanted to be angry. Instead, I curtsied because that was what I had been taught to do when I did not know how to survive a feeling. Alexander offered to escort me to the library. I said I could find it myself. I could not, of course. 10 minutes later, a silent footman appeared and guided me there without admitting he had been sent. On the reading table, beside the window, waited a cup of honey tea and a book about palace maps. On top of the book was a note in Alexander's precise handwriting, for when the architecture betrays you again. I almost smiled. Then I remembered the word compatible, and the smile broke before it became real. I stopped drinking the honey tea after that. It sat on my table every evening, warm and golden, sending up soft curls of steam that smelled like comfort, and every evening I let it cool untouched. It was childish. I knew that. But there are moments when a person has so little control over his own life that refusing a cup of tea begins to feel like rebellion. Alexander noticed on the second night. Of course he did. The man could detect political betrayal from across a ballroom. An untouched cup of tea never stood a chance. He said nothing at first. At dinner, he only glanced at my place setting, where I pushed roasted carrots around my plate, and pretended not to feel the weight of him beside me. The dining hall was filled with nobles discussing harvest numbers, border roads, and a visiting duke's new hunting dogs, all very grand topics that somehow made me miss Noah complaining about canned peas. At home, dinner had been noisy even when there was not enough food. My father would tell the same story about meeting my mother at a county fair, how she had beaten him at ring toss 3 times, and then shared her funnel cake because she felt sorry for him. Noah would groan and say, "We know, Dad," but he always smiled before the end. In the palace, forks touched porcelain like tiny polite bells, and no one said anything they truly meant. Halfway through the meal, Lord Cresswell began speaking about my family's estate as if it were an object on a ledger. The Whitmore property is modest, but strategically placed near the northern road. A useful acquisition, had the marriage not preserved their claim. I kept my eyes on my plate. My face stayed calm because Lady Marin had trained me well, but my hand tightened around the fork until the silver pressed into my palm. Useful. There it was again. The word seemed to follow me through the palace like a draft under a closed door. Alexander's voice cut through the conversation. House Whitmore remains under its own name. The table quieted. Lord Cresswell smiled carefully. Naturally, Your Majesty. I only meant that sentiment can be expensive. Alexander set down his glass. Not loudly. Just enough. Then charge the expense to me. No one laughed. I should have felt protected. Instead, I felt dangerously close to crying, which made me angry enough to survive the rest of dinner. When it ended, I escaped to the winter garden, a glass room tucked against the east wing where orange trees grew in huge clay pots, and the air smelled faintly of wet leaves. It was the only place in the palace that felt alive in an ordinary way. A gardener had left a tray of seedlings near the fountain, tiny green shoots reaching upward with ridiculous optimism. I crouched beside them and touched the soil. Too dry. I found a brass watering can and filled it halfway because my mother had once told me drowning a plant was still a kind of neglect. You know how to care for them. Alexander's voice came from behind me. I nearly spilled water on my shoes. Your Majesty. The title landed between us colder than the glass walls. He looked tired tonight. Not dramatic tired. Human tired. There was a faint crease between his brows, and the top button of his formal coat was undone, as if even kings needed 1 inch of air after pretending all day. Alexander, he corrected quietly. I stood, wiping my damp fingers against my sleeve. Is that an order? His mouth almost moved. Not a smile, but the memory of one. No, that made it worse. I looked away first. You should not defend my family at dinner if you only did it because they are part of the agreement. He was silent long enough that I heard rain ticking against the glass roof. Is that what you think? I do not know what to think. My voice cracked on the last word, and I hated it. I heard Lord Cresswell. I saw the line in the contract. Compatible. Useful. Delicate solution. Everyone here speaks about me like I am medicine in a pretty coat. Something changed in his face then, a restrained pain that vanished almost as soon as it appeared. You were never meant to hear that. I laughed once, soft and empty. That does not make it less true. Alexander stepped closer, then stopped before the distance could become pressure. When I was 7, my mother left the palace in the middle of a snowstorm because she said this place had turned my father into a statue. She kissed my forehead, promised she would send for me, and never did. I stared at him. I had not expected a confession. Not from him. Not here among orange trees and wet soil. I spent years believing people only stayed if duty chained them down. He continued. So I made duty my language. It is a poor one. The anger inside me loosened, just enough to hurt differently. He looked at the seedlings, not at me. Your family was already on a list for royal protection before the council suggested marriage. Your father's illness, your brother's age, your unpaid levies. I signed the order because no child should be taken for a debt he did not make. Noah's face flashed in my mind so clearly I had to grip the watering can. His broken shoelace. His crooked spelling homework. His stubborn little smile. Then why marry me? I whispered. Alexander's answer was quiet. Because the council found the compatibility report after I signed it. And because I was not strong enough to stop them without exposing a weakness the kingdom would use against us both. The word weakness should have frightened me. Instead, it made the whole garden feel smaller. More intimate. More dangerous. Before I could ask what he meant, a palace bell rang twice from the western tower. Alexander's expression closed at once. A guard appeared beyond the glass doors, pale and breathless. Your Majesty, forgive the interruption. A letter has arrived from the Whitmore estate. My stomach dropped. The guard's eyes flicked to me, then away. It concerns Lord Noah. The letter was not written in Noah's hand. I knew before the seal was broken, before the guard passed it to Alexander, before the first line was read aloud in that careful royal voice people used when the news was bad and they wanted to pretend it had not already entered the room. My brother wrote with crooked letters and too much pressure, as if he believed words would behave better if pinned hard enough to the page. This letter was elegant. Smooth. Patient. It said Noah had left the Whitmore estate at dusk with a palace escort that had never been sent. It said my father had woken to find his room empty, Noah's scarf missing from the hook by the door, and one muddy sneaker abandoned near the back steps. It said there was no sign of struggle, no demand, no witness willing to speak. That was almost worse. A loud disaster gives you something to fight. A quiet one makes you question every breath. Alexander dismissed the guard, then stood very still with the paper in his hand. For one impossible second, I wanted him to look at me the way he had in the winter garden, tired and human and almost honest. Instead, the king returned. His shoulders squared. His face went cold. No one leaves this palace without my permission, he said. I blinked at him. What? Your safety is now tied to a royal investigation. Until Noah is found, you will remain in the East Wing. The words hit harder because they were calm. My brother is missing. I understand. No, you do not. My voice rose before I could smooth it down. Somewhere behind me, a servant went perfectly still. He is 13. He still puts sugar on scrambled eggs because he thinks it makes them fancy. He is probably scared out of his mind, and you are talking about wings and permission. Alexander's jaw tightened. Panic will not help him. Neither will locking me in a prettier room. Something flickered in his eyes, but he buried it beneath command. This is not a discussion. There it was. The distance. The wall. The reminder that he could hand me a knife on our wedding night and still make my life a corridor with no exits. I stepped back, and the movement seemed to cut something between us. Of course, Your Majesty. His face changed when I said it. Only a little. Not enough to matter. By morning, the palace had already made a story out of Noah. Rumors moved faster than servants carrying breakfast trays. Some said my family had staged the disappearance to gain sympathy. Others whispered that I had brought provincial trouble into the crown. One woman in the portrait hall murmured that poor blood always came with poor manners, and when I turned, she pretended to admire a painting of a dead queen. I did not cry. I had cried enough in this palace for people who would only call it proof. Instead, I folded Noah's old scarf, the one I had packed by mistake, into a square and tucked it beneath my pillow like a childish charm. I spent the day answering questions from officials who smelled faintly of ink and suspicion. What enemies did my family have? Did Noah run away before? Had my father hidden debts? Did I know anyone who might benefit from embarrassing the king? Each question made my brother feel less like a boy and more like a problem to be categorized. Alexander did not come. That was the part one tried not to notice. He sent orders, guards, search riders, sealed messages. He sent everything except himself. By evening, I understood what the palace wanted from me. Stillness. Gratitude. Silence. So I gave them the first two and kept the third only on the outside. In the library, I found an old map of the northern road, the same road near our estate. My hand shook as I traced the ink line with one finger. If someone had taken Noah using a false palace escort, they had known exactly which symbols would make him trust them. That meant someone inside the palace had helped. The thought was so cold it made my teeth ache. A soft knock came at the door. I turned, expecting a maid. Lord Cresswell stood there instead, holding a council pass that made every locked door in the East Wing look suddenly useless, his expression full of polished concern. Your Grace, he said. What a terrible ordeal. His Majesty is under great strain. I hope you will not burden him with impulsive choices. I folded the map too quickly, creasing the corner. His eyes followed the movement. A small smile touched his mouth. Family affection can make people reckless. I did not answer. I was afraid if I did, he would hear that I finally understood. This was not just about Noah. It was a leash tied around my heart. After he left, I waited until the corridor lamps were dimmed and the guards changed shift. Then I packed nothing but my mother's silver thimble, the map, and the small tin of ointment Alexander had given me. I hated myself for taking it. I took it anyway. At the window, snow had begun to fall over the palace roofs, soft as ash, quiet as a secret. I pressed Noah's scarf to my face once, breathed in the faint smell of home, and opened the hidden service door. Behind the tapestry. If Alexander wanted me safe, he should have remembered one thing. I had not come to this palace because I was safe. I had come because the people I loved were not. The service passage behind the tapestry smelled of dust, cold stone, and old secrets. I moved through it with one hand on the wall, my shoes nearly silent against the narrow floor, the map folded inside my coat, and Noah's scarf wrapped around my wrist like a promise I could not afford to break. Every few steps, I heard the palace breathing around me. Pipes ticking. Wind worrying at hidden windows. distant footsteps fading before I could tell if they were real. I had imagined escape would feel brave. It did not. It felt small and foolish and necessary. At the end of the passage, a servant's stairwell curled downward into darkness. I had made it 3 floors before a voice spoke above me. Ethan. Not your grace. Not Lord Whitmore. My name, raw and quiet, in a place where no one else should have known to look. I stopped with my hand on the railing. Alexander stood at the top of the stairs without a crown, without guards, his coat unbuttoned as if he had dressed in a hurry. He did not look angry. That was worse. Anger would have been easier to hate. Move aside, I said. My voice sounded braver than my hands felt. He came down 2 steps, then stopped, leaving space between us. Always space. Always that careful distance that had once felt like kindness, and now felt like another locked door. You cannot go alone. I can. You will be followed before you reach the outer gate. Then I will run faster. Ethan. Do not. The word came out sharp enough to echo. I reached into my coat and pulled out the small tin of ointment. For a second, it looked absurd in my palm, this little round thing that had somehow become heavier than my wedding ring. I held it out to him. Take it back. His eyes dropped to it. Something in his face went still. Why? I almost laughed, but there was no humor left in me. Because I do not know what it means anymore. I do not know if it was kindness, guilt, management, or another part of making sure your compatible bride did not fall apart before she became useful. He flinched. Not dramatically. Just a tiny break in the mask, like frost cracking at the edge of a window. That is not what you are. Then what am I? The stairwell was so quiet I could hear my own breathing. Tell me without sounding like a king. Alexander looked at me for a long moment. The lamp on the wall painted shadows under his eyes, and for the first time, I saw how tired he truly was. Not powerful tired. Not important tired. Lonely tired. You are the first person in years, he said, who made this palace feel less like a sentence. The words landed softly, and that made them hurt more. I wanted to keep my anger clean. I wanted it sharp enough to carry me out the door. But there he was, saying the one thing I had not prepared myself to survive. I looked away. You should have told me the truth. I know. You should have trusted me. I know. You should have come when the letter arrived instead of sending orders. His silence changed. I looked back and saw it then, the regret, deep and immediate, not hidden quickly enough. I did come, he said. I stood outside your door for almost an hour. My throat tightened. Why did you not knock? His answer was barely above a whisper. Because every time I have entered someone's life, it has cost them something. I hated how much I understood that. I hated how my fingers curled around the tin instead of dropping it into his hand. Down below, somewhere beyond the wall, a door opened and closed. Voices murmured. The changing guard. Time slipping away. Alexander stepped to the side, not enough to block me, enough to show me he could have and chose not to. If you still want to leave, I will not stop you. I stared at the space he had made. Freedom, narrow and cold, waiting at the bottom of the stairs. But? I asked. His mouth tightened. But Noah was not taken north. My body went completely still. Alexander reached into his coat and unfolded a small scrap of blue fabric. Noah's scarf had a tear near one end, stitched by my own hand with crooked gray thread. The scrap in Alexander's palm matched it exactly. This was found inside the palace. Walls, he said. In the old chapel beneath the west tower. For a moment, the whole world shrank to that piece of cloth. Not the road. Not the estate. Not the gates I had been trying to reach. Noah had been here. Under the same roof. Beneath the same palace that had taught me how to be silent. Alexander's voice lowered, steady but no longer cold. Someone wanted you to run. I closed my hand around the ointment tin until its edge bit my skin, and in the quiet stairwell between escape and return, I finally understood that the trap had never been outside the palace. We did not go to the old chapel right away. That was Alexander's decision, and for once, I understood the shape of his caution. A frightened brother could be moved if the wrong person sensed panic. A guilty courtier could disappear behind a dozen polished doors. So we returned to the east wing as if nothing had changed, walking side by side through the sleeping palace while my whole body screamed to run ahead. Alexander's face had become unreadable again, the public mask lowered into place, but his hand stayed near mine without touching it. Close enough that I felt the choice in the empty inch between us. In my room, the fire had burned low. The honey tea on the table was cold, untouched like all the others. My small bag lay open on the chair, one sleeve hanging over the edge, my mother's thimble missing because it was still in my pocket. Alexander saw everything. The packed clothes. The map. The scarf I had tied around my wrist. He said nothing at first, and that silence was different from all the others. It was not command. It was consequence. You were really leaving, he said. I looked at the floor. Yes. The word was simple. It hurt anyway. He crossed the room slowly, stopping by the desk where several folded sheets of paper sat beneath an unlit lamp. My letters to home. The ones I had written and never sent because every version sounded like a lie. Dear Father, I am well. Dear Noah, the palace is beautiful. Dear Noah, I wish you could see the library. Dear Noah, I am scared too. Alexander did not read them. He only noticed the top one, where Noah's name curved across the page in my careful handwriting. His throat moved once. I should have asked what you missed. I almost told him it did not matter now, but that would have been another lie. You were busy ruling a kingdom. That is not an excuse. His voice was quiet, almost rough. It is a habit. For the first time, I wondered what it cost him to admit even that much. Outside this room, he was the ice crown, the alpha king who never bent, never hesitated, never let the court see a wound. Inside, he stood beside a desk full of unsent letters and looked like a man realizing he had mistaken silence for strength. A soft knock came before either of us could speak again. Lady Marin entered with a tray she nearly dropped when she saw Alexander. Her usual sharpness vanished into a stiff bow. Your Majesty. Your Grace. Forgive me. I was told to bring fresh tea. I stared at her. At this hour? Her eyes flicked toward Alexander, then to me, and for one strange second she looked less like a tutor maid of rules and more like a tired woman who had been carrying too many of them. His Majesty ordered honey tea kept warm for you every 2 hours, she said carefully. Since the wedding? The room went very still. I turned to Alexander. He looked away first. That small surrender did more to me than any grand confession could have. Lady Marin set the tray down, then hesitated. And the shoes, she added, so quietly I almost missed it. He had 3 cobblers summoned before dawn after the chapel ceremony. One was from 6 miles outside the city because he was known for soft leather. Alexander closed his eyes for half a breath. Marin. She bowed again, but her mouth tightened with something like defiance. Respectfully, Your Majesty, some truths become cruel when kept too long. Then she left us with the tea steaming between us. I did not know whether to laugh or cry. So I did neither. I picked up the cup with both hands, letting the warmth seep into my fingers. You could have told me, I said. Alexander's answer came after a long pause. I thought actions would be safer than words. For whom? He looked at me then, and the cold blue of his eyes had softened into something almost unbearable. For me. The honesty sat between us, fragile as glass. Then a bell sounded once from the west tower. Not the hour bell. A lower note. A signal. Alexander's expression changed instantly. He moved to the window, pushed aside the curtain, and looked toward the dark shape of the old chapel. A single light had appeared beneath it, flickering where no light should have been. My fingers tightened around the cup. The tea trembled but did not spill. Alexander turned back to me, no crown, no distance, only urgency held perfectly still. "Ethan," he said, "I think Noah is alive." The old chapel beneath the west tower had no stained glass, no gold, no painted kings watching from above. It was the part of the palace no one showed visitors, built low into the stone with narrow halls and air that smelled of dust, candle wax, and rain seeping through old cracks. Alexander did not bring an army of guards. He brought only Lady Maren, me, and 2 silent guards who knew how to obey without asking the wrong questions, because this time he did not decide my pain made me too fragile for the truth. We moved quietly, following the faint light beneath the chapel door. My hands were shaking, but not from fear alone. Somewhere on the other side of that stone, Noah might be waiting. When Alexander pushed the door open, the first thing I saw was my brother's muddy sneaker. The second was Noah himself, sitting on a wooden bench with a blanket around his shoulders, pale and exhausted but awake. "Ethan?" he whispered. I crossed the room before anyone could stop me and dropped to my knees in front of him. He smelled like cold air, dust, and the peppermint candies he always kept in his pocket. Real. Alive. I touched his face, his hair, his hands, as if I needed to prove the world had not tricked me again. "You are okay," I kept saying, even though I was the one falling apart. "You are okay." Noah tried to smile. "I knew you would come." Behind us, Lord Cresswell stepped from the shadows with his hands raised, his face still polished, still calm, as if hiding a boy under a chapel was only a disagreement in etiquette. He started to speak about loyalty, stability, the danger of a king weakened by attachment. Alexander did not let him finish. He did not shout. He did not move closer. He only looked at him with the full weight of the crown and said, "You mistook my restraint for permission." That was all. Lady Maren had already delivered the servant records, the false escort order, and the copied seal from Cresswell's office. The 2 silent guards took Cresswell away without spectacle, and somehow the quiet made it heavier. In the days that followed, the palace changed slowly, not magically. Rumors did not vanish because truth arrived. Some nobles still looked at me and saw a debt paid in silk. Some servants still paused before kindness. My father was brought to the capital for treatment. Noah was given a room with too many pillows and immediately complained that royal soup needed more salt, and Alexander ordered the council records opened so every family harmed by wartime levies could be reviewed. It was not a fairy tale ending. It was paperwork, apologies, long meetings, and mornings where grief still found me before breakfast. A week after Noah was found, Alexander came to my room with a document in his hand. No crown. No formal coat. Just a white shirt, tired eyes, and ink on his thumb again. He placed the paper on my desk. "An annulment," he said. My chest went tight. "You want me to leave? I want you to be able to." His voice was steady, but his hands were not. "Your family remains protected. Your father's care will continue. Noah will never owe the crown a day of service. None of that depends on you staying married to me." With Cresswell exposed and the council records opened, no one could pretend the marriage contract had been clean. For a long moment, I could not speak. This was what I had wanted in the stairwell. A door. A real one. And now that it stood open, I understood how much it mattered that he had opened it himself. I went home for 3 days. I slept in my old room beneath the slanted ceiling. I fixed Noah's shoelace. I made my father tea. I stood in the kitchen where the red royal seal had once burned on the table, and waited to feel like I had returned to myself. I did in some ways. But I also missed the winter garden. The impossible library. The man who sent honey tea because words scared him more than enemies. On the 4th morning, I found Alexander in the palace greenhouse, frowning at a rosemary plant he had clearly overwatered. "You are drowning it," I said. He turned so quickly a drop of water fell from the leaves onto his sleeve. For once, the ice crown looked completely caught. I was following instructions. Badly. A small, careful smile touched his mouth. I walked to the plant, took the can from his hand, and set it aside. Then I looked at him, really looked, without the contract between us. I am not here because of a debt. His voice softened. I know. And I am not here because you saved my family. I know. I took his ink-stained hand. I am here because I want to learn what we become when no one is buying, owing, or hiding. Alexander bowed his head over our joined hands, not like a king accepting victory, but like a man being trusted with something breakable. Months later, we held a second ceremony in the winter garden, small enough for laughter, warm enough for Noah to sneak extra cake, simple enough that my father cried without pretending it was allergies. Alexander did not call me useful. He did not call me necessary. When he placed the ring back on my finger, he called me Ethan, and this time, I believed he meant it.